I think for many producers, that's something that is not attractive. They don't want to get to that place where they cease to be an active creative producer and become instead essentially an executive. We build these amazing worlds and then we go camp in them. And at the end of the shoot, we pack it all up and leave instead of building a house and staying there and, seeing all of the potential of this world we've built and exploiting it fully. With more capital, we can grow. With more capital, we can take risks. With more capital, we can smooth the madness and we can ride the technology wave rather than just go under it. And for that, we need capital.
Hello and welcome to We Interrupt This Broadcast, your weekly dive into the Australian screen industry. This week's deep dive is a collaboration between our podcast and Compton School, looking at how to right-size your screen business in the Australian production landscape. I'm Kirsty Stark from We Interrupt This Broadcast. Our guest today is David Court, founder of Compton School, a business school for creative people with courses running across Australia and New Zealand. Welcome, David.
Hi, Kirsty. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to see you and to be on this amazing podcast.
Yeah, you've been on the podcast before with Julie talking about mentoring several episodes back. And I think it's probably a good time with all of the market shifts to talk about what is the right size for an Australian screen business and how do you make yourself sustainable. There have been so many conversations I've been having in the background with other producers and production companies in the wake of Matchbox closing down. The conversation has always been about how do you scale your business in order to make it more efficient and manage those risks across a production landscape that does have a lot of ups and downs. And so Matchbox and other companies of a similar size were always the goal. It's like, how do you grow? How do you build your business processes? How do you set yourself up for investment? I think it's been quite destabilizing for a lot of producers to go, well, if Matchbox is closing, then what hope do the rest of us have?
Well, they're great questions. And I guess, the closure of Matchbox was a shock, I think, to many people, but it does point to these very questions of, what is the right size? Where are we headed? How is the business shaping? I think they're all good questions to be thinking about at this time. Look, I think in the end, there's no one answer to that question of right sizing. It's about what you're trying to do, who you're partnered with. It's about the circumstances of the industry at the time. I mean, I think you have to start by acknowledging that we're in a period of downturn. We've been, I think, in fact, in a long historical downturn where more and more of the production activity in Australia is taking place in the form of international productions brought to Australia by location offsets and so on. That's now probably about half of all measured activity in the sector, whereas Australian production per se has, become a smaller and smaller part. And I think we've been in a long-term systemic decline in a way. It's very slow over time, but in real terms, we are less than we were. And the other thing, of course, that's happening is production is moving. It's shifting north to Queensland, shifting west to Western Australia. It's not all centred in Sydney and Melbourne as it once was. But we've got the structural long-term decline of free-to-air television. We've got the consolidation now happening in the streaming space. Witness most recently the Paramount takeover or attempted takeover of Warner Brothers. So all of those things speak to, a reduced demand and a consolidation of demand. And I guess for producers, a downshift coming off the back, of course, of a historic high, which was peak TV, which for us only really probably peaked last year. And perhaps for people who are, relatively new to the business, that's perhaps set their expectations in the wrong place. That was always going to, come to an end. It was during a land grab period by the streamers when they were furiously putting their foot on everything they could and trying to, be first and biggest and best. That was never going to last. And I guess if you take a long enough perspective, you'll see that was a, happy event in our careers, in our lives, but one that was destined to come to an end.
When you look at that long historic timeline, how often do you see those cycles occur? Would we be expecting another one, another upturn in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
Well, will it be an upturn or a downturn? Certainly there's a lot of push and pull. We're not an industry that settles into a stable pattern of slow, continuous growth. We're up and down quite a lot, and it's not just market shocks like the advent of streaming. It's technology shocks themselves. We've got AI coming down the pike. No one's really quite sure what that will mean. And then you get demographic shifts, audience taste shifts, what people even want to make. So formats, genres. We're not a business that sails blithely on. You always have to have your head up, looking over the horizon to see what might be next. And you need to be built with a view to being capable of fairly rapid adaptation to circumstance. And that mitigates or goes to that question of right sizing, right? Because if you have a very stable environment, obviously you can have a stable business, you can grow in a stable way. But because our business is volatile, demand can come and go like a gust of wind. People do need to be thinking about that in the way they structure their businesses, and that mitigates for smaller rather than larger, I think. It pushes us in that direction. So, whilst I would probably consistently advocate for scale, I think there's always a case for more, bigger, but I always have a caveat, which is that in times of difficulty, or when you're trying to do something really difficult or different or big or dangerous or risky, there's a great case for couch surfing, for being in the smallest shape you can be. So there's no one answer, although I would, consistently say that if you can be bigger, be a bit bigger, because there are clear and obvious benefits of a bit of scale. And they go to things like just smoothing out the risk of being committed to a single project at a time, which is incredibly risky for producers. And also smoothing out the flow of revenues. If you're doing this, it's very hard to build anything on that, or to stabilize, or even to think about the next project. So trying to get a bit of scale gives you a capacity to smooth the risk and smooth the revenues. And also, I think, smooth the emotional demands of producing, which are significant. It's a very hard thing to be the person who wakes up every morning and is full of beans and brightness and light. To do that every day consistently is a hard thing. If there's a team, then there's those days when you can, fall into their arms a little and let other people carry the burden. So I think even just emotionally, that case for, being in a larger group, and not necessarily a group of employees. It could be people that you partner with. It could be people that you work with consistently on some kind of contractual basis. It could even just be a co-op where you're sharing space, but just being with others and having that ability to manage the emotional demands, I think is an important thing.
Absolutely. Especially when you're in an industry where people are competing against each other for a scarce number of broadcast slots or streamer slots or commissions, it can feel quite isolating to always want to put on that front of everything's okay, I'm fine, the projects are all moving ahead. And you often don't realize how many other people are probably struggling in the exact same way that you are.
We're all struggling, quietly, or paddling furiously, as they say, whilst floating smoothly across the surface.
So, for people who are in that space of where do I go from here? What should I be thinking about in my business? At this point in time where there is so much flux, what would you suggest as some guiding principles to be thinking about?
Look, I think when there is so much flux, it's hard to be thinking about growth, even though, as I say, that's the thing I constantly press for. So this would be a time when you would probably be battening down the hatches somewhat, and not necessarily in a growth mode or growth phase. Thinking about key partners, who you can partner with, making those collaborations. I think also we're shifting into a model where there's, probably at any given time in Australia, 20 or 30 really significant production houses that have fantastic connections to sales agents, to markets, that have a presence in markets and are well known and trusted by the major partners, streamers and others.
Would you say that's across feature and TV, factual and narrative?
Yeah, pretty much. And I think therefore, the model for many producers will be to partner with those larger production houses, to be in a relationship with a larger production house, or maybe more than one, and build those connections. I think that's a model. And indeed, that's, that's really the model that's evolved in the industry globally. I think that we have the larger production houses who are, in a sense, less and less involved in production, more and more involved in sales, distribution, financing. And they need to have and are searching for relationships with creative production partners that they can work with to deliver their slates. So if I were a smaller production house or kitchen table producer, that's what I'd be looking for, to build those relationships and connections, maybe with one or two of the larger houses, and, have them, in a sense, represent me in the market and take charge of that critical bit of the trust process in dealing with the streamers, which is, they don't know me. Can they trust me to deliver on a $10 million project? Well, the answer is, park me under a trusted production house that will oversee the production. So I think that's where I would probably head if I were not one of the 20 or 30 big houses. I'd try to partner with one or more of them.
And that brings opportunities around resourcing as well, because they'll often have in-house business teams or legal teams or accounting teams that can offset some of that work that it takes to get a show into development and off the ground.
That's right, which leaves you free to focus on the creative. And of course, for many producers, that's the bit they love. That's the bit they want to do. They don't really want to be involved in the financing or the sales, or they play their part, but it's not where their heart is. So I think there is a logic in this kind of evolving structure, which I would describe as like a solar system, where you see, you know, a central production, big production house, big studio in a sense, circling around it like planets, like a solar system, smaller production houses, some close, some far, some Pluto, some Venus. And they're in a relationship with a sun, a solar source that drives really the overall output of the solar system, drives the relationships with key streamers, drives the relationships with, with financiers, with investors, and lets the smaller planets get on with the business of producing.
I love that as an image. And then I guess there's space for, the rogue planets or the distant stars that are the small independent production companies that are bootstrapping and going it on their own and being quite agile and able to move between different opportunities. Do you think the middle ground is falling out of the market? Do you think those opportunities are being lost now if we're shifting towards a small number of big production companies overseeing things, and then the lower budget, scrappy opportunities that are out there?
Possibly. It's a little early to say, but you might be right. That might be a really good intuition. And I think, to be honest, I think that middle ground is a really hard place to be. What we're talking about now is perhaps a house that would produce a show a year, or, something like that, fairly constantly in production, but not a big outfit, not at all the markets, not with an investor in their pocket, able to, close the financing of their shows. So I think that's a difficult place to be, because you're in a sense, you're neither fish nor fowl. You're neither big enough and ugly enough to be at all the markets, to have the big relationship with the streamer, to weather the storms as they come. And you don't have the virtues of what I would describe as the kitchen table producer who doesn't have overhead, who can, hunker down during the lean times, maybe do something else, maybe got a day job, maybe has some other way of making money. And I think it's hard to stabilize in that space. In a sense, you either need to be bigger or you need to be smaller. And that's a constant imperative with producers. Do I go bigger or do I go smaller? Do I go bigger? Do I go smaller? There is a point, of course, where if you get to be a really big production house, you're not really a production house anymore. You may call yourself one, but really you're a distribution house, and your business is distribution and financing, actually. I think for many producers, that's something that is not attractive. They don't want to get to that place where they cease to be an active creative producer and become instead essentially an executive, someone who is helping to finance, distribute, close the production of other people's shows. That's not the place they want to end up. So there's always, I think, an ambivalence among producers about, getting big for that very reason. And on the other hand, they want to get big because they don't want to have to worry about next week's wages. They don't want to, worry if they're going to have the wherewithal to get to markets this year. They'd wish that there was some continuity, some resource, some capacity, some assistance, always being pulled between those two poles, if you like.
Can we go into some specific advice or characteristics for the small versus the large, just in terms of helping people think about which direction they might want to go in if they feel like they are in the midsection of the market? So starting with small, the benefits are that agility, that bootstrappy mindset.
It's also the taking of risk. When you're smaller and you don't have 5 people who are expecting you to pay wages on Friday, you can take the bigger creative risks. You can wait things out. You can, just decide to go for something that's hard and difficult and just to weather whatever that takes to get there. When I think of people who've done big, hard productions, quite often though, it's just their ability to persist that matters. And, probably the easiest way to persist is to get into a small shape with low overhead or no overhead. And as I say, find yourself a day job if you need to, but hang in there is the point, right? Simple persistence can matter hugely for something that's creatively brave or difficult or innovative or different. Small is the best shape for that by far. And there is something in that scrappy indie kitchen table producer model that's deeply attractive, I think, because it preserves that possibility of independence and of scrappiness and of saying no and of holding out and of, giving the finger if necessary to the powers that be and just persisting. That's a thing, right? And I think it's in the makeup of many producers to feel like that, to want to be in that space. So that, I think, is a completely legitimate model.
And when you're thinking about that small size, are you thinking one sole producer? Are you thinking a team of two as a partnership? Are you thinking?
Yeah, it could be 2 or 3 or 4 people. And maybe they've got some side hustle business, producing corporate work or whatever that helps them stay in the game. But, essentially they're not scaling up to consistent output of high level shows, right? They're not doing one a year. They're doing one when they can. They're doing one when they've got one. They're doing one when they can get it up, as opposed to someone who's trying to move to a position of regular, more or less predictable output of production, predictable, stable relationships with key buyers, that sort of space. And then if you get to that space and there's maybe 5 or 6 people, then you start aspiring to the next level up, which is where, again, you get a bit more smoothing, a bit more revenue, a bit more profit, a few more opportunities, more attendance at markets, more attention from the market itself. People aspire to that. And the question becomes, can you do that without becoming a suit, without becoming an, executive of a distribution company? Do you stay a producer in this next level up? And that's always, I think, the conundrum for producers. Do I want to take that next further step, or do I want to stay down here where I'm still involved regularly? I'm on set, I'm making those creative calls. That's the sticky place for people. And quite often their answer to that question will change over time, will change depending on their life circumstances. There's times when you want a bit of stability in your life, and other times when you're more able to accommodate, variation, change, risk taking, and so on.
When we look at the big end of the market and trying to partner with those production companies that have the stability, do you think that's possible? I mean, I look at them and their models, and from the outside, it seems like they have their internal group of producers who might each have a little mini slate, or they're setting themselves up so that they are able to consistently generate output from within the company. So perhaps they're teaming up more with writers or directors or the creatives that are coming with the ideas, as opposed to a creative producer who might be facilitating that process. What are you seeing?
When people build those larger production houses and try to do it all in-house, that's typically in a periods of growth and success. So, if you think about the peak TV period when Netflix was throwing cash around and buying the stakes in production houses, that's when you're trying to put your arms around the talent, and when there's a lot of competition and you feel like you need to bring those people in-house in order to have dependable access to their output, right? We're not in one of those periods. And I think now, as we've seen with NBC and Matchbox, the bigger players are looking around saying, do I need to have all of that in-house? Would there not be a case for simply going fishing in the wider industry for the projects and the talent that I want to work with. Actually, this goes back 70 years to Arthur Krim and United Artists in the post-war period, when Arthur Krim and his partner Robert Benjamin took control of United Artists and realized that they didn't need to be a studio with a backlot and with a whole lot of people under contract. They had no resources. The business had been almost completely run down. They couldn't afford a backlot. They couldn't afford people on contract. And Arthur Krim realized this was actually a golden opportunity for him, because now he could search the whole wide world for the best films, the best talent, and go sign them. And he's the person who invented the 50-50 deal with the talent, right? He invented that deal and shopped it to the wide world of filmmakers. And they all thought, well, this sounds pretty good. Let's go work with Arthur Krim and United Artists. For 20 years, they had this amazing run of best pictures and extraordinary films. And I think that was the recognition that, in a sense, rather than trying to do everything in-house and trying to control everything, trying to be in complete charge of the process, that you can open the doors. You can, in fact, throw the doors wide open and see who comes towards you, make them an offer, make it attractive to them, as Arthur Krim did. And so I think we're in one of those periods where, rather than people trying to consolidate and hold everything internally and be in control, I think we're in a period where the bigger houses will tend to look outside. So I think opportunity will all be on the indie side. If you've got the hot idea, then opportunity is with you.
If that's the case, would you suggest that independent producers are going to market first and getting interest in their idea and then trying to team up with one of the bigger production houses? Or would you say go under that umbrella initially, develop together, and then pitch?
Good question. Look, in a negotiation, it's always advantageous to bring a little more, right? So the more the proof points you've got, the more evidence you've got of demand for the thing you're trying to do, the better. Going in early gives you the comfort, perhaps, of an early answer and a reduction of uncertainty, but at the cost of a reduced negotiating position. It's where you sit in that spectrum of, risk taking. How prepared are you to punt yourself to a market, take the risk that it doesn't work out, versus the opportunity that might arise if you do actually get some interest at the market, and maybe there's even a bit of competition for the show and you're in a better position. So it's just how much time, how much money you got in the bank, all those things will go into that consideration.
Do you think we have the structure in Australia to support the meeting and the marketplace and the business? Like, we have Screen Forever and AIDC and these traditional marketplaces that tend to be more producers pitching to the market itself. Do you think we have a system set up where there is the ability for these production houses to find independent projects and creatives and get attached to the talent that is coming through?
I constantly think that we could do better at this. Obviously, we've got all these evolved marketplaces and ways of people connecting, and they do all work. We've also got all these amazing technologies for connecting with each other. And I've personally been involved in the construction of various platforms designed to facilitate, or to be a platform for more engagement, more pitching, more hearing about things, more involvement too in projects, right? I mean, one of the big things we need in order to arrive at really strong projects is we need feedback. We need to see people engaging with what we are doing. We need to have our work out in the world in one form or another, collecting evidence of engagement or of no engagement. So the more that we can do to, bring about more of a hubbub, more of a noisy marketplace, more of a crowded, teeming marketplace, the better.
Yeah, I think momentum is such a big part of getting a project off the ground, like creating that buzz and opportunity. And that can be done publicly and audience facing, especially at the bootstrapped level of trying to build the audience and the engagement around a project before you then go and pitch it. But it can also be done on that one-to-one individual level, whether it is directly to the streamer or the broadcaster or the bigger production house, and bringing individuals on who add their weight to the project and get it one step closer to green light.
I would say momentum is the central, mysterious, beautiful art of the producer. That's the thing. momentum is the thing that brings you out of the pack, that brings attention, brings heat. It's like a heat signature, isn't it? And it's as though the world is scouring for that heat signature.
What do you think we need to do in the industry from a structural or cultural perspective to encourage that active open marketplace? Because I do get a sense sometimes that everyone's hunkered down, they're busy, there's too much to do and not enough time, they're burnt out, they're focused on their existing projects. It's just so much to have the capacity to open the doors wide and look for new ideas and new projects. Can we change something to make that easier?
I think technology could help, but I also think as an industry, we're a bit ragged. And I attribute that raggedness to just a lack of capital. We're a very, very thinly capitalized industry. We attract capital for our projects, but very rarely for our businesses. And I think it shows, we just don't quite have the substance and the process and the people in the room sometimes to make things happen. We've been a secretive business in a way. We don't tell much of our story. We haven't engaged well with capital markets. In fact, we've engaged poorly with capital markets and we're not much trusted. One of the things that always intrigues me is there's ABS data on the profitability of production companies in Australia, and it's about 8%. And I look at that and I think, well, if it were 12%, if it were 15%, our lives would be so different. And so I feel like we're just not quite in this space of being financially feasible to a wider industry, a wider capital market, assuming that it's just looking at us in a plain way without any special love or affection. It's just looking at us as one business or industry against another. We're not quite there.
Can you explain what that 8% and that 12% mean?
8% is not quite investment grade. 12% is investment grade. 15% is excellent, would be excellent. So we're just short of being something that would be attractive to investors.
When you're talking 8%, you're talking about an 8% return on an investment?
Yeah. If we could attract capital, we could be a very different industry with less ragged, more able to ride out the rough times, the rough seas that we encounter a lot, more able to take risk. That's probably the single biggest thing. You need capital in order to take risks. That's what capital is for. It's for taking risks. So I think working harder at being investor ready, working harder at building a story that is plausible to the investment community, and maybe also rethinking the asset class that we're offering. We don't offer typically a very attractive proposition. We offer them equity project by project, which is about the worst possible way you could present our industry because it's the most risky. To invest in a single project at the equity level there is no more high risk position in our industry. And yet that's what we consistently offer investors. Or we offer them, discounting the producer offset. We never offer them positions or opportunities that are properly structured in a way that would make sense to a typical investor, i.e., we should be offering portfolios of investment, not single shot. And we should also offer them, the ability to be up and down the waterfall of recruitment, not always at the bottom. Let them form a position based on their risk assessment. Maybe sometimes they're halfway up the waterfall, sometimes they're at the bottom, and sometimes they're at the top. But there should be a range of opportunities, not just one. Here you go, take this ticket and go sit at the bottom of the waterfall. Thanks. This is not a proposition that is going to ever compel systematic investment in our sector. So we're always going to be hand to mouth. We're always going to be one investor at a time, banking on them probably having a bit of a love affair with the film business or something. And we pay a price for this. And the price is we're thinly capitalized, we're raggedy, we can't take risks when we want to, we can't ride out the rough times easily. Just sit it out in those times when you need to sit it out.
For a company thinking about maybe getting themselves investor ready, what would you say those characteristics need to be? Is there a particular number of staff? Is there a particular diversity of slate? What would you recommend?
There's no single answer to that. You have to build a story, a proposition that's going to make sense. Usually that would involve being a little bit bigger, but having that sort of consistency of output. But I can imagine a case where a maverick producer could sell themselves. So I'm not saying that there's only one way to do this, but yeah, a bit bigger, more consistent output, being able to report in it. So having good systems. And indeed having a history of reporting of the business. Ian Murray, who talks about this question, says that you need 3 years to get your business into a shape that will make sense to an investor. You need to go at it in an organized way for 3 years to be ready for the conversation. And that's probably right. It's not something you can just do tomorrow because you've decided you need some capital. You've got to work towards being investor worthy. And then think about, what's the position for the investor? And importantly, also, what's the exit? Which means that you have to be thinking about selling or recapitalizing the business at some point. But it's not for everyone. But, the other thing that could happen is maybe, capital enters at this level of the business, but it can then spread and circulate through the industry. So it's not like we have to be bringing investors to, the small production houses. If we can bring them into the bigger production houses, then their capital will find its way through the whole sector, right? It's just finding and building those regular, dependable entry points for capital so that there is more capital circulating in our industry and not just in the projects that we make, but in our businesses too. And if we need risk capital for our projects to develop them, to make them everything that they can be, then we need to bring capital in for that purpose, right? I feel a lot, and I'm sure many producers would agree, that we sometimes rush into production because we need to make a fee or because the window's open right now, and we don't have the time to fully explore the potential of the thing we're building. To me, it's like we build these amazing worlds and then we go camp in them, and at the end of the shoot, we pack it all up and leave instead of building a house and staying there and, seeing all of the potential of the thing, this world we've built, and exploiting it fully. If you look at the top 20 films of the last 20 years, right, 18 of them are sequels or remakes or franchises, right? We don't seem to have learned that lesson fully. We have a few things that fit that bill, but really we're still in the business of originals, and we're making one at a time. And there can be great virtue and cultural value in that, but to miss the boat of seeing the potential of these worlds that we build and exploiting them fully and finding every bit of value in them. That to me seems like the big, grown up, mature challenge of our industry from here forward.
And you do see that it takes time to grow IP.
You can't do it. How long did Tolkien spend building his legendarium? 30 something years, right? I mean, he's the extreme example, but I do think, yes, to really understand and fully explore the value of a world would take 5 to 10 years. And we don't have an industry that's geared to that. We're geared to, getting something into production next week.
Alongside just more content, there's also all of the peripheral revenue streams that surround a project that aren't often being exploited. And you just look at something like Bluey and the merchandise and the games and the movie spin-off. There's so much opportunity if you have a property that you can grow to a level where it's got that audience engagement and that fan base. You can exploit that really well to profit.
And even, Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries or The Dressmaker, the wardrobe exhibition that Sue Maslin ran in conjunction with the National Trust. It was a very profitable thing to do off the back of a successful movie. But we don't have time to pause and think about those opportunities. We have to rush to the next thing because we don't have any capital.
If someone was to go down the rogue maverick producer route, do you have any suggestions or recommendations for them? What would you do as a sole operator to really maximize or leverage your own position and make the most of, potentially one or two key ideas that you could just keep working on long term?
A few things. If I thought I really had my foot on something good, something truly valuable and generative, I'd think about finding an investor just to give me the ability to persist with it. I'd think about trying to own more of the value chain and maybe own a different bit. So can I own the distribution rights? Are there adjacent things that I could be doing or building that would help to realize the value of that property? I think there's all sorts of opportunities that sit outside that box, and we don't exploit them because we don't have a financing model for them, right? But I'm thinking of things like, associated tourism or wardrobe exhibitions or stage shows or whatever it might be that, that might be an ancillary exploitation of the same underlying intellectual property. Just thinking all the way around that opportunity, all 360 degrees. And as you say, that takes time. It's not like you're going to be able to think it through over the weekend. That's years of work to really understand the opportunity. But if you think about producers who are successful, it's quite often that they've just continued to really work at a particular property. They've just continued to explore it and develop its potential. And then they've found maybe some new way to take their business. That's a fairly consistent story if you look back historically at the successful production houses. I think of people like John Maynard, who saw that the business opportunity was in distribution, but his model was, he wanted to be a producer. He still is a producer. That's all he really wants to do. But he saw the opportunity and saw how he could take responsibility for that, and he would build this little pop-up distribution entity, Footprint Films. And there'd be 10 people working the distribution of a film, and they'd be there for 3 months or 6 months or whatever it would be, and then they close it down again. That was a really clever way to be in business, and he was incredibly successful with that. With films like Once Were Warriors, Samson and Delilah. Extraordinary, clever distribution. He saw that he could do that. He saw that probably he was the only person who could execute the vision he had of how those films should be exploited, and made it work for him, made it work for the filmmakers. So there, we should take inspiration from that kind of maverick, left field, out of the box thinking. This is an industry that really rewards that kind of thinking. There's always opportunity. There's always an angle if we have the time and the opportunity and the will to find it.
Where are you seeing the value in technology and direct to audience models and opportunity to build your brand directly? Because there's a lot of people working in that space, and so far it feels like it doesn't quite have the financial payoff needed to sustain a business or a property long term. Do you think it will get there?
I think probably in the short term opportunity of that is not so much that you're going to earn a revenue stream from that direct audience, but rather that you can have a feedback loop and use that to help drive your own process, and also to provide evidence to other players of the strength of market interest in your property. So I think it's those sort of nearer term values that are probably the most significant. In principle, it's that idea, if you had 1,000 people who each paid you $100 a year, there you've got a living suddenly. If you could be in a direct relationship to them. I was reading something the other day that, in the music business, 2% of an artist's following, 2% will generate around 20% of their streams and around 50% of their ticket sales and merch sales. If you can find and connect with that 2%, I don't know that it's quite like that in the screen business, but I do think if you can be in some kind of direct relationship with audiences, then you are in a superior position from a point of view of understanding what you have, understanding how to develop and improve what you have, and also understand the story that's going to cut through, the way that you're going to be able to tell this story. One of the things I always thought was really hard about our business was you had to work for so long without any feedback, apart from, script assessors and people like that. There was no actual audience feedback opportunity. So I've always thought anything you can do to get something back early has got to be worthwhile, rather than getting all the way to the end only to discover that, hey, no one was interested, or you had some kind of wrong handle on it, or there was something about it that didn't land. Better to find that out earlier.
Yeah, I've always seen productions as startups, and every new piece of IP is a new startup business that you really have to grow from scratch and build a business model around, and financing around, and marketing around, and figure out who your audience is. And it's a wonder that so many production companies survive when they're generating projects again and again over time and managing to repeat that formula in a way that sustains them.
Yeah. Look, if we didn't have government support, if we didn't have funding agencies that helped in that process, I'm sure the attrition would be much, much higher.
It's tough out there.
It is. Yeah.
Well, thank you, David. This has been so great to have the chance to pick your brain and see things from that bigger perspective that a lot of us don't often get to think about when we're busy running our production companies. I know we've asked you previously, but we ask all of our guests if they have big ideas to shape the future of our industry. Is there something in this space or theme that you'd love to add to that collection?
I think we need private capital, and we've got a very checkered history of trying to engage with private capital. We need to come at it fresh, turn the page, fresh sheet of paper. How are we going to do this? What's the right way to structure this? How can we go about this systematically, carefully, responsibly, and successfully? Because with more capital, we can grow. With more capital, we can take risks. With more capital, we can smooth the madness, right? And we can ride the technology wave rather than just go under it. We need to ride it, not duck it. And for that, we need capital.
Who should be driving that in the Australian landscape? Should it be government? Should it be production companies? Should it be state agencies?
Look, I think the agencies are all are paying some attention to this, and they can certainly facilitate, and certainly their cooperation is required. They need to make room at the table for private capital. But in the end, I actually think producers should drive this.
Do you think there's space for a collaboration between mid-sized and major production companies to come together and get this model right? Do you think it would benefit us to do that, or is there too much competition and too much at stake?
One of the reasons there is competition, tough competition between producers, is that we're fighting again for a limited pool or a defined pool of funds. And for as long as that's the case, we'll find it difficult to collaborate. But as soon as we don't have to fight for the same pot of money, we can collaborate. We saw that with the producer offset, right? But the producer offset was open-ended. There was not a fist fight for a closed pool of funds. And the minute that happened, there was greater collaboration between producers. Producers should collaborate. It's in their interest to escape the boundary, to escape the limitations of a single source of cash, single source of capital. The more that we can open new doors, the more we can collaborate, the better and stronger and more viable and more competitive globally, because we shouldn't be fighting with each other. We should be fighting in the global marketplace. The more competitive we will be.
And do you think that capital is out there?
For sure. The world is awash in capital if you can create the right opportunities for it. There is no shortage of capital.
Amazing. Thanks so much, David. We Interrupt This broadcast is recorded on the unceded lands of the
Gadigal people of the Eora Nation,
the Turrbal and Yagara people,
the Yugambeh language people, and the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we acknowledge them as the traditional custodians and first storytellers of these regions.
Always was, always will be.